What drives ordinary people to abandon everything they know and follow charismatic leaders into darkness? If you're fascinated by the psychology behind history's most notorious cults and want to understand how manipulation, control, and tragedy unfold in real time, you've found the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're about to dive deep into stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human nature, religious freedom, and the dangerous power of blind faith. I'm Boring Nightmares, and this is where we explore the twisted minds and devastating consequences of the world's deadliest cults. Let's begin. In the misty hollows and forgotten corners of Appalachia, where ancient mountains keep their secrets and isolated communities have thrived for generations, some of the most shocking and dangerous religious movements in American history have taken root. Today, we're diving into the dark world of three Appalachian cults that most people have never heard of, but whose stories will leave you questioning how such extreme groups could operate for decades in plain sight. We're talking about New Vrindaban, the Hare Krishna community that became a criminal empire built on murder and child abuse. The serpent-handling churches, where believers literally dance with death every Sunday, and the 12 tribes, a seemingly wholesome religious commune hiding disturbing secrets behind their famous Yellow Deli restaurants. These aren't just stories of misguided faith. These are accounts of manipulation, violence, and exploitation that thrived in the isolated mountain communities where outside authority was distant and local law enforcement often looked the other way. What makes these groups particularly chilling is how they used the cover of religious freedom and the natural isolation of Appalachian terrain to create their own twisted kingdoms, where leaders wielded absolute power over their followers' lives, bodies, and even their children. The Appalachian region has always been a place where people went to escape mainstream society, whether fleeing religious persecution, government interference, or simply seeking a simpler way of life. But this same isolation that attracted sincere spiritual seekers also provided the perfect cover for dangerous cult leaders to establish communities where normal rules didn't apply. In these remote mountain valleys and ridgetops, charismatic leaders could rewrite reality for their followers, creating closed worlds where questioning authority became unthinkable and outside contact was forbidden or heavily controlled. What you're about to discover challenges our understanding of religious freedom in America and reveals how easily spiritual communities can transform into something far more sinister when accountability disappears and power becomes concentrated in the hands of those willing to exploit it. These aren't ancient history either. Some of these groups are still active today, continuing practices that have claimed dozens of lives and traumatized countless others. Let's start with New Vrindaban, a Hare Krishna community nestled in the rolling hills of West Virginia that began as a spiritual utopia but descended into one of the most shocking criminal conspiracies in religious history. Founded in the late 1960s by Kirtanananda Swami, whose real name was Keith Gordon Ham, New Vrindaban was originally envisioned as an authentic recreation of ancient Vedic village life in America. The community's centerpiece was Prabhupada's Palace of Gold, an ornate temple complex that became West Virginia's third largest tourist attraction, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually who came to marvel at its intricate architecture and seemingly peaceful spiritual atmosphere. But behind this glittering facade lay a criminal empire that federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the most extensive religious fraud schemes in American history. Under Kirtanananda's increasingly authoritarian rule, New Vrindaban systematically deviated from traditional Hare Krishna teachings and transformed into what experts recognize as a classic personality cult. The community funded its lavish lifestyle and construction projects through an elaborate network of illegal schemes, including the sale of counterfeit merchandise bearing copyrighted sports team logos, drug trafficking operations, and prostitution rings that generated millions of dollars in illegal revenue. The counterfeit operation alone was staggering in its scope. Devotees were sent across the country to sell fake merchandise at airports, sporting events, and busy intersections, often working 18-hour days in conditions that former members describe as virtual slavery. They were told that this work was sacred service to Krishna, but in reality, it was funding Kirtanananda's increasingly grandiose lifestyle and his construction of what he claimed would be a spiritual city to rival Vatican City in importance. But the financial crimes were just the beginning. As federal investigators dug deeper into New Vrindaban's operations, they uncovered evidence of systematic child abuse within the community's school system. The Gurukula, as it was called, was supposed to provide traditional Vedic education to the children of devotees, but instead became a nightmare of sexual and physical abuse. Multiple witnesses testified that child molestation was rampant throughout the school, with teachers, administrators, and even Kirtanananda himself accused of sexually abusing minors. Former students, now adults, have described in harrowing detail how they were systematically abused by authority figures who used their religious positions to exploit vulnerable children. The abuse wasn't limited to sexual assault. Children were subjected to severe beatings, forced labor, and psychological manipulation designed to break their will and ensure absolute obedience. When concerned parents or community members tried to raise complaints about the treatment of children, they were told that questioning the guru's methods was tantamount to spiritual suicide. What makes the New Vrindaban case particularly disturbing is how Kirtanananda used genuine spiritual seeking as a weapon against his followers. Many of the devotees who joined the community were sincere spiritual seekers looking for meaning and purpose in their lives. They surrendered their possessions, their careers, and often their relationships with family members outside the community, leaving them completely dependent on Kirtanananda's organization. This dependency was then systematically exploited to force them into illegal activities and to silence them when they witnessed abuse. The violence at New Vrindaban wasn't limited to the systematic abuse of children and exploitation of adult followers. Federal investigators uncovered evidence of a conspiracy to murder former devotees who posed a threat to Kirtanananda's power and criminal enterprise. The most notorious case involved Stephen Bryant, a former New Vrindaban resident who had become increasingly vocal about the criminal activities he witnessed within the community. Bryant had begun publicly accusing Kirtanananda of child molestation, drug smuggling, and fraud in the months leading up to his death. His outspoken criticism made him a marked man within the community's inner circle. In 1986, Bryant was found shot twice in the head at close range in Los Angeles in what police described as a professional-style execution. The murder was later traced back to Thomas Drescher, a devotee who served as one of Kirtanananda's enforcers within the community. Drescher's role within New Vrindaban reveals the extent to which the community had transformed from a spiritual organization into something resembling an organized crime family. Former members describe how Drescher and other loyal followers were used to intimidate dissidents, collect money from reluctant participants in illegal schemes, and eliminate threats to Kirtanananda's power. The murder of Stephen Bryant wasn't an isolated incident of violence, but part of a systematic campaign to silence anyone who might expose the community's criminal activities to outside authorities. Another alleged murder victim was Charles St. Denis, a devotee who disappeared in 1983 and whose body was never found. Like Bryant, St. Denis had begun questioning Kirtanananda's leadership and expressing doubts about the community's direction. Former members report that St. Denis had discovered financial irregularities and was preparing to contact law enforcement when he vanished without a trace. Thomas Drescher was also charged with St. Denis's murder, though the lack of a body made prosecution more difficult. The federal government's investigation of New Vrindaban culminated in 1990 when Kirtanananda was indicted on multiple charges of racketeering, mail fraud, and conspiracy to murder. The indictment painted a picture of a spiritual leader who had completely abandoned any pretense of religious purpose and had instead created a criminal organization that used religious devotion as a cover for extensive illegal activities. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Kirtanananda had ordered the murders of Bryant and St. Denis because they threatened to expose his criminal empire to federal authorities. Witnesses testified about the climate of fear that pervaded New Vrindaban, where questioning the guru's authority could result in violent retaliation. The prosecution's case revealed how completely Kirtanananda had corrupted the spiritual ideals that originally attracted followers to the community. Kirtanananda was ultimately convicted on 9 of 11 charges against him in 1991, though the murder conspiracy charges were later overturned on appeal due to prejudicial evidence. He eventually pleaded guilty to racketeering charges and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, though he served only 8 years before being released due to poor health. His conviction and imprisonment marked the end of New Vrindaban's era as a criminal enterprise, but the damage to the broader Hare Krishna movement and to the individual victims of his crimes continues to this day. The legacy of New Vrindaban serves as a stark reminder of how spiritual authority can be corrupted when it operates without accountability or oversight. The community's location in rural West Virginia provided the perfect cover for Kirtanananda's criminal activities, allowing him to create an isolated world where his word was law and outside interference was minimal. Former members describe how the beautiful mountain setting and the genuine spiritual practices that continued alongside the criminal activities created a cognitive dissonance that made it difficult for followers to recognize the extent of the corruption around them. Today, New Vrindaban continues to exist as a Hare Krishna community, but under completely different leadership and with extensive reforms designed to prevent the kind of abuse that characterized the Kirtanananda era. The community was expelled from the International Hare Krishna organization in 1988, but was readmitted in 1998 after demonstrating its commitment to legitimate spiritual practice. However, the dark history of murder, fraud, and abuse continues to shadow its reputation and serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority. The new Vrindaban case reveals how easily a legitimate spiritual community can be transformed into something sinister when charismatic leaders exploit the trust and devotion of their followers. The collapse of New Vrindaban sent shockwaves through not just the Hare Krishna movement, but the entire nation, as people struggled to comprehend how a community that promised spiritual enlightenment had become a haven for predators and murderers. The federal investigation revealed a systematic pattern of exploitation that went far beyond financial fraud. Testimonies from survivors painted a horrifying picture of children being systematically abused within the Gurukula school system, with some victims as young as 6 years old reporting brutal sexual assaults by teachers, administrators, and even visiting swamis who were supposed to be their spiritual guides. What made the new Vrindaban tragedy particularly devastating was how Kirtanananda had weaponized the very concept of spiritual surrender that forms the foundation of Krishna consciousness. Former devotees described how questioning any aspect of his leadership was branded as spiritual weakness or demonic influence. Parents who expressed concerns about their children's welfare were told they were being selfish and needed to surrender their attachments for the greater good of the community. This psychological manipulation created an environment where even the most basic parental instincts were suppressed in the name of spiritual advancement. The palace itself, that golden monument that drew hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, was revealed to be built quite literally on blood money. Federal prosecutors traced the funding sources back to elaborate criminal enterprises that included not just the counterfeit merchandise operations, but sophisticated drug trafficking networks that moved marijuana and other substances through the community's legitimate businesses. Devotees were unknowingly serving as mules and distributors, believing they were participating in sacred service while actually facilitating drug deals across state lines. Perhaps most chilling were the detailed accounts of how dissent was handled within the community. Stephen Bryant, the former devotee whose murder made national headlines, had begun documenting a pattern of financial irregularities and child abuse as early as 1984. His letters to ISKCON leadership in India detailed specific instances of children being molested, devotees being beaten for questioning authority, and millions of dollars being diverted from the community's charitable purposes into Kirtanananda's personal accounts. When these letters began circulating among other ISKCON communities, Bryant became a marked man. The execution-style murder of Stephen Bryant in Los Angeles was carried out with professional precision that shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. Thomas Drescher, the man convicted of pulling the trigger, was described by prosecutors as Kirtanananda's personal enforcer, someone who had been systematically desensitized to violence through years of participating in brutal beatings of community members who stepped out of line. The murder weapon was never recovered, and evidence suggested that multiple people had been involved in planning and executing the killing, indicating a level of criminal sophistication that went far beyond a simple religious dispute. The disappearance of Charles St. Denis revealed an even darker dimension to the community's operations. St. Denis had been asking uncomfortable questions about missing community funds and had reportedly threatened to go to federal authorities with evidence of systematic financial fraud. Unlike Bryant, who was killed away from the community, Saintist, Denis simply vanished from New Vrindaban itself, suggesting that the community had the capability and willingness to eliminate threats from within its own boundaries. His body was never found, despite extensive searches of the surrounding West Virginia wilderness. Former members who testified during the federal trials described a community where violence had become normalized as a tool of spiritual correction. Children and adults alike were subjected to brutal beatings for infractions as minor as asking questions about doctrine or expressing homesickness. The most disturbing testimonies came from women who described being sexually assaulted by Kirtanananda and other leaders, then being told that their victimization was part of their spiritual purification process. These women were often isolated from their families and convinced that reporting the abuse would result in spiritual damnation. The financial scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Beyond the $10 million in counterfeit merchandise sales, investigators uncovered elaborate money laundering schemes that involved legitimate businesses, real estate transactions, and even international banking. The Palace of Gold, which cost an estimated $4 million to construct in the 1980s, was funded through a combination of fraudulent activities and the unpaid labor of devotees who believed they were building a monument to Krishna, but were actually constructing a testament to one man's criminal ambitions. What made the New Vrindaban case particularly significant in the context of Appalachian cults was how the isolation of the West Virginia mountains had enabled the community to operate with virtual impunity for nearly 2 decades. Local law enforcement was either intimidated by the community's political connections or simply lacked the resources to investigate such a complex criminal organization. The community had cultivated relationships with local politicians and business leaders, presenting itself as a major tourist attraction that brought economic benefits to the region while concealing the criminal activities that funded its operations. The psychological trauma inflicted on the children raised within New Vrindaban continues to reverberate decades after the community's downfall. Many of the Gurukula survivors have struggled with severe PTSD, substance abuse, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. Several have committed suicide, unable to cope with the lasting effects of the systematic abuse they endured. Class action lawsuits filed on behalf of these survivors have revealed the true scope of the institutional child abuse, with some estimates suggesting that hundreds of children were victimized during the community's peak years. The international implications of the New Vrindaban scandal extended far beyond Appalachia. ESKCON communities worldwide were forced to confront the reality that their movement had been infiltrated by criminal elements who used spiritual authority as a cover for the most heinous crimes. The scandal led to significant reforms within the broader Hare Krishna movement, including the implementation of child protection policies and financial oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar abuses from occurring in other communities. The story of New Vrindaban serves as a stark reminder of how quickly spiritual communities can transform into criminal enterprises when proper oversight and accountability are absent. The combination of charismatic leadership, religious authority, and geographic isolation created perfect conditions for the systematic exploitation of sincere spiritual seekers. The community's eventual downfall came not through internal reform or spiritual awakening, but through federal law enforcement intervention, highlighting the importance of external oversight in preventing such tragedies. Today, what remains of New Vrindaban operates under significantly different leadership and has implemented extensive safeguards designed to prevent the return of the criminal elements that once controlled the community. However, the legacy of Kirtanananda's reign of terror continues to cast a shadow over the property, serving as a constant reminder of how easily the promise of spiritual enlightenment can mask the darkest human impulses. The Golden Palace still stands, but for many who lived through those dark years, it remains a monument not to divine glory, but to human corruption and the devastating consequences of unchecked power. The New Vrindaban tragedy represents one of the most comprehensive examples of how isolated religious communities in Appalachia became breeding grounds for criminal enterprises that exploited the very people they claimed to serve. Moving beyond New Vrindaban's criminal empire, we encounter another disturbing manifestation of religious extremism in the Appalachian Mountains: the serpent-handling churches. These congregations represent perhaps the most visibly dangerous form of worship ever practiced on American soil, where faith literally becomes a matter of life and death every Sunday morning. Picture this: a small wooden church tucked away in a remote Kentucky hollow, where the congregation gathers not just to pray, but to deliberately handle rattlesnakes, copperheads, and water moccasins as proof of their divine protection. This isn't metaphorical spiritual warfare. This is real venom, real fangs, and real death stalking the aisles of worship. The practice stems from a literal interpretation of Mark 16:17-18, where Jesus allegedly promised that true believers would take up serpents without harm. What began in the early 1900s with a Tennessee preacher named George Went Hensley has evolved into a tradition that has claimed over 100 lives in the past century. Yet remarkably, each death only seems to strengthen the survivor's conviction that God is calling the faithful home. The psychological dynamics at work in these churches reveal how isolation and desperation can transform religious devotion into something resembling collective madness. Worshippers enter trance-like states during services, speaking in tongues while wrapping 5-foot timber rattlers around their necks like deadly jewelry. The atmosphere becomes electric, with a mixture of terror and ecstasy that outside observers describe as unlike anything else in American religious experience. What makes these churches particularly chilling is their complete rejection of medical intervention. When members are bitten, and they are bitten regularly, seeking anti-venom or hospital treatment is considered a betrayal of faith. Families watch their loved ones writhe in agony for hours or days, believing that divine healing will come if their faith remains pure. Those who survive often suffer permanent nerve damage, tissue death, and disfigurement, wearing their scars as badges of spiritual honor. The death toll tells a horrific story. George Went Hensley himself, the founder of modern snake handling, died from a rattlesnake bite in 1955. The Coots family of Kentucky has lost multiple generations to the practice. Jamie Coots died in 2014 after refusing medical treatment for a bite, following in the footsteps of other family members who made the same fatal choice. Each funeral becomes both a tragedy and a testament, with survivors interpreting the deaths not as preventable accidents, but as God's mysterious will. Perhaps most disturbing is the presence of children at these services. While some churches claim to keep minors away from the serpents, former members report that the entire environment exposes children to trauma and danger. Kids grow up believing that their parents' survival depends on their collective faith, creating psychological burdens no child should bear. The sight of a parent convulsing from snakebite becomes normalized as part of God's plan. The legal battles surrounding these churches reveal the complex intersection of religious freedom and public safety in America. Most Appalachian states have banned the public handling of venomous snakes, but enforcement proves nearly impossible when services occur in remote, private locations. Law enforcement officers describe the challenge of balancing constitutional protections with the obvious danger these practices pose to participants and their families. One case that exposed the darker potential of this movement involved Reverend Glenn Summerford, who was convicted of attempted murder in 1992 after forcing his wife to put her hand into a crate of rattlesnakes. This incident revealed how the culture of snake handling could enable domestic abuse and coercion under the guise of testing faith. The isolation of these communities often prevents such crimes from coming to light until it's too late. The serpent-handling tradition persists because it offers something that mainstream religion cannot: absolute proof of divine favor or judgment. In economically devastated Appalachian communities where people feel abandoned by society and government, these churches provide a sense of power and purpose. Members believe they possess a direct hotline to God that wealthy televangelists and seminary-trained pastors lack. The third group that has left an indelible mark on Appalachian religious culture is the 12 Tribes, a communal Christian movement that began in Tennessee in 1972 under Gene Spriggs' leadership. Unlike the spontaneous violence of New Vrindaban or the self-destructive practices of snake handlers, the 12 Tribes represents a more systematically abusive form of cult control that has perfected the art of hiding darkness behind a facade of wholesome community living. To most outsiders, the 12 Tribes appears to be living the American dream of simple, sustainable community life. Their Yellow Deli restaurants serve organic food in charming, rustic settings that attract tourists and locals alike. Their members dress modestly, speak softly, and present themselves as devoted families committed to biblical living. This carefully crafted image has allowed them to operate with minimal scrutiny while implementing one of the most comprehensive systems of control and abuse documented in modern American religious movements. The group's fundamental doctrine requires members to surrender everything: property, money, personal autonomy, and even their children's well-being to achieve spiritual perfection. New recruits are gradually isolated from outside influences as television, radio, secular books, and contact with former friends and family are systematically eliminated. This isolation isn't presented as restriction, but as liberation from a corrupt world that prevents spiritual growth. What distinguishes the 12 Tribes from other controlling religious groups is their systematic and unapologetic use of physical violence against children. The group has codified child abuse in their child training manual, which mandates that parents beat their children daily with thin wooden rods to ensure complete obedience. This isn't occasional corporal punishment. Former members describe children as young as 6 months old being struck repeatedly until they stop crying or showing any sign of resistance. The theological justification for this violence centers on the group's belief that they must raise exactly 144,000 perfect male virgins to facilitate Jesus' return. Every moment of defiance, every childish impulse, every natural behavior is seen as Satan's influence that must be literally beaten out of the child. Former members describe children being struck until they bled, collapsed, or lost consciousness, with parents who showed mercy being accused of loving Satan more than their children. The international scope of this abuse became undeniable in 2013 when German police raided 12 tribes communities and removed 40 children from their parents' custody. Undercover journalists had secretly recorded adults systematically beating children with canes while other community members watched approvingly. The European Court of Human Rights later upheld Germany's actions, recognizing that the state's duty to protect children superseded religious freedom claims. Beyond physical abuse, the 12 tribes operates what critics describe as a sophisticated labor exploitation scheme. Adult members work 12 to 16-hour days in the group's businesses without pay, receiving only basic room and board while generating substantial profits for the organization. Children are integrated into this labor system from an early age, with investigations revealing violations of child labor laws in their agricultural and manufacturing operations. The group's teachings reveal a worldview that goes beyond mere authoritarianism into explicit racism, misogyny, and homophobia that would shock most Americans. Internal documents describe Black people as destined by God to be servants, homosexuals as deserving death, and women as requiring constant supervision to atone for Eve's original sin. These beliefs are carefully hidden from new recruits and the general public, but they form the theological foundation for the group's hierarchical structure. Perhaps most insidiously, the 12 tribes has developed sophisticated methods for handling sexual abuse within their communities without involving outside authorities. Former members report that when abuse is discovered, the response depends entirely on the perpetrator's status within the group's hierarchy. High-ranking members might be quietly transferred to other communities, while lower-status individuals face internal discipline that often amounts to victim blaming and cover-ups. The 2024 conviction of community elder Nehemiah Smith for sexually abusing 2 girls in Massachusetts provided a rare glimpse into the group's internal dysfunction, as most cases never reach public attention due to the community's isolation and members' fear of speaking out. The psychological control exercised over members makes reporting abuse feel like betraying God Himself, creating a perfect environment for predators to operate with impunity. What makes the 12 tribes particularly dangerous is their ability to appear normal and even admirable to casual observers. Their businesses provide legitimate services, their members seem happy and healthy, and their commitment to environmental sustainability and simple living appeals to many people disillusioned with modern society. This positive public image provides cover for practices that would be immediately recognized as abusive in other contexts. The group's presence in Appalachian communities reflects the region's historical pattern of providing refuge for religious movements that couldn't survive in more populated areas. The combination of geographic isolation, cultural respect for religious autonomy, and economic desperation creates conditions where groups like the 12 tribes can establish themselves and resist outside intervention for decades. These three groups, New Vrindaban, the serpent-handling churches, and the 12 tribes, represent different aspects of how religious extremism has flourished in Appalachian isolation. New Vrindaban showed how spiritual authority can become criminal enterprise. The snake handlers demonstrate how faith can become literally fatal, and the 12 tribes reveals how abuse can be systematized and sanctified through religious doctrine. The common thread connecting all three is the way Appalachia's geographic and cultural isolation has allowed dangerous religious practices to persist long after they would have been shut down in more accessible locations. The question that haunts investigators and survivors alike isn't just how these groups managed to operate for so long, but how they continue to adapt and survive even after being exposed. What we're witnessing across Appalachian cult activity isn't just isolated incidents of abuse, but sophisticated systems of psychological manipulation that have been refined over decades of practice. The geographic isolation that initially protected these groups has now become their greatest vulnerability in the digital age. Former members can now connect with each other across vast distances, sharing stories and building cases that would have been impossible to construct in the pre-internet era. Social media platforms have become powerful tools for survivors to find their voices and expose the truth about their experiences. Yet paradoxically, this same technology has also allowed these groups to develop more subtle recruitment methods and maintain connections with isolated communities in ways that bypass traditional oversight. What makes the Appalachian cult phenomenon particularly insidious is how these groups have learned to exploit the region's legitimate cultural values. The deep-rooted traditions of religious independence, self-reliance, and distrust of government interference that define much of Appalachian culture create perfect cover for manipulative leaders. They present themselves as guardians of authentic faith against the corrupting influences of modern society, appealing to genuine concerns about moral decay and spiritual emptiness that resonate with many rural Americans. The recruitment patterns across all three groups reveal a disturbing consistency in their targeting methods. New Vrindaban drew in idealistic young people seeking spiritual enlightenment during the counterculture movement of the 1960s and 70s. Serpent-handling churches attract individuals from economically disadvantaged backgrounds who find meaning and community in dramatic displays of faith. The 12 tribes specifically targets families in crisis, offering stability and purpose to those overwhelmed by the complexities of modern life. In each case, legitimate human needs for belonging, purpose, and spiritual connection are exploited and weaponized against the very people seeking help. The financial structures underlying these groups reveal sophisticated operations that go far beyond simple religious communities. New Vrindaban's elaborate fundraising schemes generated millions of dollars through what amounted to organized crime, using religious devotion as a cover for fraud and violence. The 12 tribes operates a network of businesses that essentially function as fronts for unpaid labor, with members working extensive hours in exchange for basic survival needs, while the leadership controls all financial resources. Even serpent-handling churches, despite their apparent poverty, often involve complex systems of donations and support that flow to charismatic leaders who live significantly better than their followers. The psychological conditioning techniques employed by these groups show remarkable similarities to those used by recognized cults worldwide. Isolation from outside influences, sleep deprivation through endless religious activities, nutritional control, and the systematic breaking down of individual identity are common themes. Members are taught that questioning leadership equals questioning God, creating a psychological trap where doubt becomes evidence of spiritual failure. The constant threat of spiritual damnation for disobedience keeps members compliant, even when they witness obvious contradictions between the group's teachings and leadership behavior. Perhaps most disturbing is how these groups have learned to exploit the legal system's reluctance to interfere with religious practices. The First Amendment's protection of religious freedom, while essential to American democracy, creates gray areas that manipulative leaders expertly navigate. They frame clearly abusive practices as religious expression, making it difficult for law enforcement to intervene without appearing to violate constitutional protections. The intergenerational trauma created by these groups extends far beyond their immediate membership. Children raised in these environments often struggle with basic social skills, educational deficits, and severe psychological damage that affects them throughout their lives. Many have never learned to make independent decisions, trust their own judgment, or form healthy relationships outside the group structure. The process of leaving these communities often means abandoning family members who remain behind, creating additional layers of loss and guilt that compound the healing process. Law enforcement agencies have developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to investigating these groups, but the challenges remain enormous. The remote locations, insular communities, and religious protections create perfect storms for abuse to continue unchecked. Federal agencies now coordinate more effectively with local authorities, but the jurisdictional complexities of crimes that cross state lines while hiding behind religious exemptions continue to frustrate prosecutors. The testimony of former members remains crucial, but witnesses often struggle with credibility issues due to the psychological manipulation they've endured. The role of mental health professionals in addressing cult-related trauma has evolved significantly as more survivors come forward. Specialized treatment approaches now exist for cult survivors, recognizing that traditional therapy methods may not be effective for individuals who have been subjected to systematic psychological manipulation. The concept of complex trauma has become essential in understanding how prolonged exposure to cult environments affects brain development and psychological functioning in ways that simple PTSD treatments cannot address. What emerges from studying these Appalachian cults is a pattern of exploitation that transcends religious boundaries and speaks to fundamental vulnerabilities in human psychology and social structures. These groups succeed because they offer something that mainstream society often fails to provide: a sense of absolute certainty, clear purpose, and tight community bonds. The tragedy is that they deliver these benefits through methods that ultimately destroy the very people they claim to serve. The legacy of these groups continues to ripple through Appalachian communities long after their peak influence has passed. Families remain divided, with some members still believing in the group's teachings, while others work to expose the truth. Properties once used for religious purposes stand as reminders of the harm that can be done when charismatic leadership meets vulnerable populations in isolated settings. The scars on local communities run deep, affecting not just direct victims, but entire networks of people who were touched by these groups' influence. Understanding these phenomena requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how religious freedom can be weaponized, how isolation can enable abuse, and how the search for meaning and community can be exploited by those who understand human psychology's darkest vulnerabilities. The most chilling aspect of these three groups isn't just their individual crimes and abuses, but how they represent a disturbing pattern of exploitation that continues to this day. Each of these organizations demonstrates how religious authority, when combined with geographic isolation and cultural insularity, can create perfect conditions for systematic abuse that spans generations. What makes the Appalachian region particularly vulnerable to these dangerous groups is a combination of factors that create ideal hunting grounds for predatory leaders. The mountainous terrain provides natural barriers that limit outside scrutiny and law enforcement access. The strong cultural emphasis on religious freedom and suspicion of government interference means communities are often reluctant to report suspicious activities or cooperate with investigations. Economic desperation in many rural areas makes people more susceptible to groups promising community support and financial security. The tradition of insular, tightly knit communities means that questioning authority figures is often seen as betrayal of family and faiths. These groups also exploit legitimate spiritual needs and desires. People genuinely seeking deeper meaning, community connection, and spiritual experience become trapped in systems designed to extract maximum value from their devotion. New Vrindaban attracted sincere seekers of Krishna consciousness who wanted to live according to ancient spiritual principles. Serpent-handling churches draw people seeking authentic, powerful religious experiences that demonstrate God's protection. The 12 Tribes appeals to those wanting to live, like the early Christians, in true community. The tragedy is how these legitimate spiritual aspirations become weaponized against the very people seeking fulfillment. The psychological manipulation employed by these groups follows remarkably similar patterns. Leaders isolate members from outside influences and support systems, making them dependent on the group for all their needs. They create elaborate ideologies that explain away contradictions and failures while elevating the leader's authority to near divine status. They use shame, guilt, and fear to control behavior, convincing members that questioning leadership equals spiritual failure. They exploit natural human desires for belonging, purpose, and transcendence, then gradually increase demands and control as members become more invested. The intergenerational trauma caused by these groups is particularly devastating. Children born into these environments often suffer severe physical, sexual, and psychological abuse while being taught that this treatment is normal or even blessed by God. They're denied proper education, medical care, and exposure to the outside world, making it extremely difficult to leave even as adults. Many struggle with basic life skills, social integration, and mental health issues long after escaping. The cycle often continues as traumatized individuals either remain trapped in abusive systems or seek out similar controlling relationships in their adult lives. Law enforcement faces unique challenges when dealing with these groups. The remote locations make surveillance and investigation difficult. The groups often have advance warning of raids through their networks of supporters and informants. Religious freedom protections can be exploited to shield abusive practices from scrutiny. Victims are often too intimidated, brainwashed, or isolated to cooperate with investigations. Evidence is frequently destroyed or hidden before authorities can secure it. Even when prosecutions succeed, the damage to victims has often been occurring for years or decades. The legal system's response has been inconsistent and often inadequate. While some cases, like Kirtanananda's conviction, demonstrate that justice is possible, many abuses go unpunished due to lack of evidence, uncooperative witnesses, or jurisdictional complications. Laws against child abuse, fraud, and other crimes exist, but they're often difficult to enforce in these closed communities. Some states have passed specific legislation targeting dangerous religious practices like snake handling, but enforcement remains challenging. The balance between protecting religious freedom and preventing abuse continues to create legal gray areas that these groups exploit. Modern technology and social media have created new opportunities and challenges regarding these groups. On one hand, former members can now more easily share their stories, connect with other survivors, and warn potential victims about dangerous groups. Investigative journalists and documentarians can expose abuses to wider audiences. On the other hand, these groups have adapted by using technology for recruitment, fundraising, and maintaining control over dispersed communities. They've become more sophisticated in their public relations efforts, presenting sanitized versions of their beliefs while hiding their most controversial practices. The economic impact of these groups extends beyond their immediate members. They often operate legitimate businesses that compete unfairly by using unpaid labor from members. They may avoid taxes through religious exemptions while generating significant income. Local communities may become economically dependent on their operations, creating reluctance to investigate or prosecute abuses. The costs of law enforcement investigations, court proceedings, and victim services place additional burdens on taxpayers and local resources. Recovery for survivors of these groups is a long and difficult process that often requires specialized support. Many former members suffer from complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues related to their experiences. They may struggle with basic life skills like managing finances, making independent decisions, or forming healthy relationships. Educational deficits from inadequate schooling can limit employment opportunities. The loss of family and community connections when leaving creates additional trauma and isolation. Support networks specifically designed for cult survivors have become crucial resources, though they remain underfunded and limited in availability. The broader implications of these cases extend far beyond Appalachia. They highlight fundamental questions about religious freedom, parental rights, child protection, and the role of government in regulating religious communities. They demonstrate how poverty, isolation, and social marginalization create vulnerabilities that predatory groups exploit. They show how charismatic leadership can corrupt even well-intentioned spiritual movements. They reveal the ongoing need for better education about manipulation tactics, stronger support systems for at-risk populations, and more effective legal frameworks for preventing and addressing organized abuse. Perhaps most importantly, these stories serve as warnings about the human capacity for both evil and resilience. They show how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary cruelty when placed in certain systems and circumstances. They reveal how victims can survive unimaginable abuse and trauma, often at great personal cost. They demonstrate the importance of maintaining connections to broader communities, questioning authority, and protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their trust and devotion. The legacy of New Vrindaban, serpent-handling churches, and the 12 tribes continues to unfold as survivors speak out. Investigators uncover new evidence, and society grapples with how to prevent similar tragedies. Their stories remind us that the price of freedom includes vigilance against those who would use that freedom to harm others. In the isolated hollows and hidden communities of Appalachia, that vigilance becomes even more critical as geographic and cultural barriers can shield terrible secrets from the light of justice and accountability. These cases ultimately reveal that the most dangerous cults aren't necessarily the ones that make headlines with mass suicides or violent confrontations. Often, the most insidious are those that operate quietly for decades, systematically destroying lives while maintaining facades of respectability. They remind us that evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs, but instead often wears the mask of righteousness, community, and spiritual purpose. Understanding these patterns and warning signs becomes crucial for protecting future generations from similar exploitation and abuse.